welcome to our League of Women Voters series, What Democracy Means in Everyday Life. Today's episode is Freedom of the Press, a cornerstone of democracy. I'm Marlene O'Brien, your moderator. I've served on the League's local, state, and national boards, and I'm currently secretary of the Massachusetts League. Today we'll be exploring the meaning of the First Amendment and whether the free press is truly free. With the constant threat of fake news and the fact that many have lost faith, trust, and confidence in the news media, whether that be print, radio, broadcast, cable, TV, or social media, we'll be focusing on why freedom of the press is important to preserving democracy and on current threats to press outlets' ability to report both independently and safely. The League is a nonpartisan grassroots organization that encourages informed, active participation of the public in civic life. This program will carry forward the century-long commitment of the League to safeguarding individual liberties guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. This program is co-sponsored by the Massachusetts League and co-produced by NewTV. It's being recorded on May 12th, 2026 at Newton's well-appointed studios here in Newton, Massachusetts. So welcome to our panelists. We're so proud to be featuring you today. Dan Kennedy, to my immediate left, is a professor in the School of Journalism at Northeastern University and author of 3 books on the future of journalism. Most recently, What Works in Community News with Ellen Clegg. His blog is Media Nation, and he's regularly on Beat the Press with Emily Rumi on Substack. Dan has been bestowed the Yankee Quill Award by the New England Academy of Journalists and the James Carey Journalism Award by the Medium Ecology Association. Steph Solis is co-author of Axios Boston and serves as president of the New England chapter of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. A member of NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ+ Journalists, Steph covers state government, business, immigration, and other important issues affecting Boston area residents. Sarah Stone, our third panelist, is Free Press's National Field Director and previously worked both as a Deputy Director of Strategic Advocacy at the Friends Committee on National Legislation and as Associate Editor for WagingNonviolence.org. Sarah holds a BA in International Affairs from George Washington University and an MA in Human Rights and Democracy in Southeast Europe from the University of Sarajevo. Thank you all so very much for being here. Let's begin. So this year, the U.S. hit its lowest rank in history on the World Press Freedom Index, placing 64th out of 180 countries. What factors do you feel have driven this downward trend? And would you say the American press is becoming less free? Dan, why don't we start with you?
Well, that was a drop of 7 points in the rankings. So at least according to Reporters Without Borders, that is indeed we are indeed less free than we were a few years ago. There were a number of factors that went into that. Among them, the harassment of journalists in this country, both online and in real life, corporate control of the media, lack of access to the media for ordinary members of the public. The U.S. is very good at negative rights, and negative rights are not to be sniffed at. We have strong libel protections, very little government censorship, the sort of the thou shalt nots. But we're not very good at positive rights, which is access to the media, trust in the media, and that's why we rank as low as we do.
Does either of you have anything to add to that?
I would say on the ground, having worked in a few different cities, it really varies. You also have to take into account which states have shield laws for journalists. Massachusetts does not. And while this might be a little controversial, which states allow one-party consent laws for recording as opposed to 2. Again, Massachusetts is a 2-party state. And between that and who the power players are, it can be, in some cases, easier or harder to get access to information. In some areas, institutions don't have a lot of education or practice in speaking with the public or speaking with the media, and that gets very difficult. Here, on the flip side, you have almost maybe too many or a wide variety of PR firms and other organizations that help educate these institutions, but also act as gatekeepers. And between short-staffed news outlets and fewer news outlets existing, sometimes that means there's less room to push back or dig deeper and less room for the public to get their questions answered in certain cases.
That brings us, I think, to a question perhaps you'd be willing to talk about, Sarah. Well, what are some of the economic and technological forces and pressures on news media and journalists today?
I mean, yeah, I think that I will probably share that question with both of you who've done so much work in this area. I would say that we see a lot of risks to a free and independent and open press, partly from corporate consolidation, lack of independent or nonprofit news outlets who can be really embedded and close to their community. A lot of my work at Free Press across Massachusetts has been collaborating with hyper-local and independent outlets who are really serving the needs of their communities and kind of starting from a place of what are the gaps here, what do our communities need to stay informed. But a lot of the advertising model that has underpinned the journalism industry for a long time has really collapsed. And I think being able to pursue policy solutions and other business models that will support a free and independent press that really meets the needs of those communities is really important. And also communities have a role in advocating for that as well, to make sure that they can have the information they need to participate in civic life.
Why do you think that consolidation has taken place in recent years at such a frenetic pace?
We're almost seeing a deconsolidation now, because the two major companies that moved in and acquired so many of these papers, Gannett, which has rebranded itself as USA Today Company, I guess it's sort of entering the witness protection program, and Alden Global Capital, which is a private equity firm that has acquired many papers, are, in a way, despite the major power that they continue to wield, they really seem to be less of a force today. I mean, we're here in Eastern Massachusetts, and Gannett either closed or merged almost all of its weekly newspapers. So we've seen the rise of a number of hyperlocal news projects in Eastern Massachusetts in recent years. Many of them are digital only. Some of them have a print component. Many are nonprofit, some are for-profit, but they're all independently controlled by the communities that they're located in, which is a really great development. But of course, there remains significant financial challenges for these startups, and I hope that we can find ways to move forward and help them survive and thrive, which I know is what a lot of Sarah's work is involved in.
So are there some new models that you three have seen that you think offer great promise for the future of local news as well as, regional and national?
I can share a little bit about one model that Free Press has been seeing more lawmakers and other advocates around the country pursue, which is a public grant-making fund, which is something that was piloted in New Jersey with the New Jersey Civic Information Consortium. It's something that we're also hoping to support folks to advocate for in Massachusetts. We've seen similar bills introduced in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and other parts of the country. And the idea is to really to treat local news and information as a vital public good, and to make sure that we can fund that, because we see that communities really thrive and need access to accurate local information. And if we're able to provide a source of public funding that's also open to philanthropic contributions that can really sustain that as a public good, that type of funding can be flexible to different needs across the state, knowing that there's going to be very different needs in rural Western Massachusetts than in Boston or other, in Worcester and other parts of the state. And so using like public funding and public grant making as one model to allow for more investment in a whole range of business models and news outlets that are serving their community's needs is one of the things we've.
How concerned are you about the influence of the government if it is making such grants?
I mean, I would say that a lot of this has to do with designing the legislation in a way that has really strong firewalls to preserve editorial independence. We've seen that hold up in New Jersey, but that we also recognize there are a lot of different services that we know are vital public goods that require that kind of public investment, and that this type of information that's really helping people participate, understand where they can go to vote, how to access election guides, how to participate more in civic life, that's something that has not been provided sufficiently in like the existing marketplace, that it's something that's needed to support.
Marlene, I think the concern you raise is a real one. And as Sarah said, there are protections that can be built in to prevent government interference in the news. Nevertheless, whenever you're that dependent on government funding, you're always vulnerable. The New Jersey Civic Information Consortium that Sarah refers to got zeroed out last year, and then later the money was brought back. But the first time there was a budget crisis, it's like, oh, let's get rid of the Civic Information Consortium. I think that tax credits for publishers, for advertisers, for subscribers, is more of an indirect approach that ought to be explored as well. And that has been done in Illinois and New York State and a few other places. Unfortunately, there were proposals to do this at the federal level for years, and despite considerable bipartisan support, it never happened. And then Donald Trump returned to office, and that was basically the end of that.
That said, whether it comes in the form of government funding or tax credits or philanthropic contributions, what I've seen across the board, whether it's from members of NHJ or other colleagues in the business, is that we can't really afford to do this work unless we're being paid well enough. And that doesn't always trickle down no matter where you work. There are people at news outlets of all sizes that have left Massachusetts because they can't afford to keep working, or they might work somewhere but they're not allowed to freelance, or they're not allowed to take a second job despite not being paid, as well as journalists in other part of the country. So it gets very complicated where you might have some startups or some new outlets appearing that can compete against, the big media companies in Massachusetts or the national ones that have moved in here over the recent years. But not everyone who is either top talent or even emerging talent who is in search of, an earlier mid-career opportunity is going to see a path forward here while this is all being hashed out, if it gets hashed out in Massachusetts.
So in terms of freedom of the press in particular, which is the focus of our conversation today, can you talk about what key actions have federal, state, and local governments taken that have helped or hindered freedom of the press?
Helped or hindered? Well, we mentioned a few that helped. In terms of hindering, we just saw, even as we are taping this, we're learning that the Trump administration and his acting attorney general, Todd Blanche, is threatening to subpoena the Wall Street Journal and possibly the New York Times and other news outlets. I know that Axios has been mentioned as one of the possible targets because of the reporting that they've done regarding reservations inside the Trump administration about the decision to go to war with Iran. There was another case fairly recently in which a Washington Post reporter named Hannah Nathanson her apartment was raided by the FBI, which was looking for material that would identify someone who had been leaking information to her. And in that case, a judge issued a search warrant and said after the fact that the Justice Department had failed to provide him with legally mandated guidance that would have led him not to grant that search warrant. So we're under threat every day. I mean, this is just what's on my mind this week, but
Yeah.
you know,
And
next
I
week
take-
it'll be something else.
I take it this is a deterrence to, is supposed to be, is intended to be a deterrence to future reporting.
So at a federal level, absolutely, and that has ripple effects across the country. I would also say that there are people in power or people who are leaders of their communities who have become more comfortable threatening lawsuits for unsavory stories, even if they're true. At the same time, you have states that block public records in certain areas. I mean, Massachusetts, I think, is still the only, or at least one of the only states to not allow or release public records, typically for the governor's office, for the legislature, and with few exceptions of the judiciary. And so that climate, even in a blue state like Massachusetts, makes it very hard to keep officials accountable and respond to public questions. It's a little different at the local level, but you know, you have town clerks and RAOs who are very overwhelmed with a variety of records requests, whether it's from activists, whether it's from trolls or residents just trying to find information about their government or journalists. But you know, one way or another, it's still very hard to do that job, and it's not as flashy or as likely to make national headlines as, you know, a DOJ inquiry, but it's still something that definitely prevents information from getting out there.
Sarah, do you have?
Yeah, I mean, I would just also add that there are so many different instances we've seen of journalists facing threats or detention or deportation, even like Mario Guevara, who was deported for his reporting on No King's Day
yes.
in Atlanta. There are so many different examples like this that I think, in addition to those specific cases, and it also sends a message, and it kind of can create fear for people who are both doing reporting and news gathering themselves, and also activists who might be writing an op-ed about an issue, or you know, like Rumeza Ozturk, or being outspoken, publishing opinion pieces. That all of that, I think, has a chilling effect and can create a lot of fear for people who are both doing their work as reporters and also just people who want to exercise their right to free speech. So that, I think that's an additional risk, that people can just be afraid to speak out or do reporting in ways they otherwise would. That's critical because there's such a risk of backlash now.
One league leader has asked us to ask you all about this. How does the fast-paced, algorithm-driven nature of social media challenge news independence and public trust? Would any of you like to tackle that?
Well, it is very hard to do a good job sometimes when you're distracted by misinformation on social media, or when sometimes your stories get buried on social media compared to, I don't know, things that are going viral at that moment. And so I will say it's very tough because from a journalist perspective, it's very easy to see even a story about, you know, when polling locations open and educating folks about voter registration come election season get totally ignored, and to blame the readers for not wanting to click on it and for it not getting enough page views. But people aren't even necessarily getting introduced to those stories in the first place. And every time there's a shift in the algorithm for any of these platforms, it means content creators, editors, all sorts of folks have to like work to figure it out once again.
I think we've moved away from an utter dependence on social media in the last couple of years. largely because of the fracturing of Twitter under Elon Musk. There's now a million different places to go, and I think everybody realizes that you can't keep up with them. I think that news organizations that are doing well in this environment are doing it on the basis of trusted relationships with their audience. The Boston Globe has been very successful selling digital subscriptions. These are people who are going to go to the Globe. They're not dependent on social media. Newsletters are a great way of connecting with your audience, and Steph's primary product is a newsletter. The Axios Boston newsletter. I'm a subscriber. It's good stuff. So
Free to subscribe, by the way.
yes. So I think it's a good idea to try to. You still have to make some use of social media, but I think that you need to develop that direct relationship with your audience so that you don't fall into some of the traps that Steph was talking about.
And the audience then trusts that they're learning news from a journalist,
Yes.
which brings me to an important question we had, which is, what defines a journalist today?
Well, I'm going to go on a limb and say it's not a podcast, bro. But I will say that that definition is pretty much as broad as ever. I welcome the rise of content creators who do their research, who are willing to, accept corrections or evolve as they share news or information or their expertise. I think it's a great way to disseminate news and to engage with audiences without, being beholden to a news outlet, which unfortunately a lot of times, lays off certain workers or can't afford to hire more workers, and a lot of times rely on some of the same, pool of journalists, and sometimes can actually be exclusive, whether intentional or not. And so I think it's been a great democratizing force, which many have written about and pointed out. That said, there's obviously caveats when it comes to someone working on their own, whether they're a freelancer who has relationships with established news outlets or a content creator reporting it themselves. And it's really that question of, are they holding themselves to the standards, whether it's, the Society of Professional Journalists, ethical guidelines, or some other, set of ethical bounds that they should, keep in mind, like other reporters and editors.
That's interesting. You referred, Sarah, to news and opinion reporting. The blurring, what would you say, with the blurring of news and opinion reporting, what strategies allow journalists in these news and opinion to stay independent? What are they doing to maintain, to continue to be accepted by their editors, to get their things in print or online? What are some of the strategies?
I think that a lot of journalists who are really rooted in a local outlet, for example, in their community, they're both they're responsive to the needs of that community. That is also like there's some accountability there when they're reporting on local issues. Of course, I think that journalists are taking measures, to make sure that they're fact-checking their work, that they're upholding these standards of editorial independence. I think that making sure outlets are, like when we see nonprofit outlets that are sort of independently funded and able to engage in investigative reporting in their community, I think that all of those things are important to make sure that they're reporting in a way that's independent from different influences over their funding.
I teach a class in opinion journalism. I worked in that space most of my career and still do. Opinion journalism is journalism, and it has to be rooted in fact. It has to be fair. You can't leave out inconvenient pieces of information that cut against your argument, and it has to be independent. You're not doing it on behalf of a political candidate or a political party, but you are expressing your views in the context of a well-researched, well-reported piece of journalism. And I think if you're doing that, opinion journalism can have just as much value as the non-opinionated journalism you see in other parts of the media.
Do you think the legal privileges that have been historically reserved for the press, such as protecting sources, be extended to everyone in social media and in other areas? Do you
Can I
have
jump
a
in
sense?
here?
Sure.
There are very few legal protections for journalists to protect their sources. There is no constitutional right to protect your sources. The Supreme Court decided that in 1972 in a famous case called Brandsburg versus Hayes. Now, there are 49 states that do provide some limited protection for journalists to protect their sources. But it's not absolute. A judge can always say this information is so important that we're going to require you to produce the information anyway. Steph mentioned earlier that Massachusetts does not have a shield law. The protection is very weak in Massachusetts. It comes from the courts rather than from a law. And in fact, a Boston Magazine reporter just last year came this close to being forced to produce her transcripts of a confidential interview she conducted with Karen Reed.
So what's an example of model legislation from your point of view? What other state has great, or at least better than Massachusetts, legal protection through legislation?
Even New Jersey's is better, if I recall correctly. It's been a while since I've lived there, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Even New Jersey's is better.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's never absolute.
Yeah.
It's never absolute, meaning, go ahead, could you spell that out?
What I mean is, it doesn't mean that journalists never have to reveal their sources or produce their confidential records. It does mean that you have enough protection so that you get to go before a judge, and the judge will make a determination as to whether this information is so important that we are not, that we're going to force you to release it, or this information isn't really that important. Maybe the prosecution can get this from another source, and therefore it would be too damaging to freedom of the press to force you to give up your sources.
And a lot of times there's privilege that goes into that too, because you need in-house counsel or to be able to afford your own attorney that is well-versed in press law. And so freelancers won't necessarily have that, or if they do, it really depends on what their finances look like. Content creators might have a really hard doing that unless they're well-funded themselves. And so, it's not to say that all people on social media sharing whatever news they want or whatever information they see fit, accurate or not, should have all the same rights. But there does need to be, there's something that should be said about sort of the lack of protections that exist overall, whether you have the protections of working in a newsroom with its own attorney or going at it yourself.
And when you have a local news desert, what happens in terms of government accountability, would you say?
Not good things.
Well,
Could you give us some examples?
There have been a number of studies. Voter turnout goes down. Fewer people run for political office. My favorite is something that is sometimes referred to as the corruption tax, which is that, let's say a municipality wants to borrow money to build a new fire station. That municipality will have to pay a higher rate of interest when it borrows money, because the lenders know that there's no one keeping track of how their money's being spent. So there are all kinds of ills associated with this. Political polarization goes up because people are more obsessed with what they see on Fox News than what's happening in their neighborhood.
Do you have anything to add to this?
I would just say that that the converse is also true, which would make sense, but that when you have really strong local news in a community, you can also see that engagement, voter turnout goes up, all of these democratic markers also increase. So more people run for office, more offices are contested, incumbents are less likely to be reelected because there's more people who are engaging in that process. Government is held accountable, there's more oversight. And so we can see that in a lot of cases where there's strong investment in local news and journalism, that there's also a lot of really positive outcome for the democratic infrastructure in a specific community.
Anything to add to that?
No, I mean, they covered it.
Okay. Well, what, our viewers, I'm sure, are wondering as they're watching from home, what can they do? What can residents and local elected officials do to support a free press and robust local journalism where they live? Here we are in Newton. There is some robust local journalism, and we have this wonderful we have news programs and so on at this wonderful television station, but there are plenty of parts of Massachusetts and in other parts of New England where you don't have that. What can local residents and local elected officials do?
I can start. I mean, I think that one thing, I do a lot of organizing, both in Massachusetts and in other parts of the country, of broader coalitions that bring together civic organizations like the League of Women Voters and social justice organizations and journalists and local outlets to talk with lawmakers, to engage the broader public in legislative debates and or just kind of advancing conversations about policies that could support local news. And a lot of that, I think, is really for people to just start getting involved in the conversation, to talk to their lawmakers about why they value, if they do have strong local journalism in their community, why they value that and how that allows them to participate in civic life and why it's so important to them. And if they don't, being able to talk to their lawmakers about those gaps and challenges and how that also affects their community, because I think there are a lot of ways that lawmakers are really looking right now to support local news and information across Massachusetts and in other parts of the country, and having more people reaching out and engaging in those conversations, just saying this is valuable and this is something that is really important to their community. That's a really important start, because I think we had a lobby day for local news back on Local News Day in April and at the Massachusetts State House, and legislators were extremely interested in talking to us about what they could do to support local news and to support more information being shared in their community, because they see the effects of that loss all the time and their constituents not being able to get information, and what happens when that's replaced by Facebook groups or other, people just getting information on social media or other things. And so I think there are a lot of ways that we can do broader movement building around the local news, the need for news and information with people who are not only coming at it as journalists, but they see the need in their community all the time for that information themselves.
Mm-hmm. With any policy push or any bill push, whether it's related to supporting local news or any issue on Beacon Hill, the same holds true from what I've heard from staffers. Those who call regularly and send emails, those who are active will get their legislators' attention, and it can't always be the same people who know the staffers' names. They've got to, it's one of those situations where if someone wants to get something done, you've got to get your neighbors involved, you've got to get your family involved. It can't just be the, lobbyists on the Hill usually coming out with the numbers. They actually do tend to listen to constituents and their anecdotes. But as far as how people otherwise could support local news when it comes to the industry now, I think it's in some cases as simple as asking questions, whether it's to their elected officials, whether it's to existing news outlets, asking, hey, why isn't this being covered? Hey, how does this work? Do you know why this piece of news got so much attention, or here's this other thing that isn't happening? A lot of great information I get comes from our readers who just hit reply to our newsletter. And I always tell our readers, actually, the PR people are more than happy to share information. It's their job. But the everyday person who doesn't have like a spokesperson working for them, they have to work that much harder to get something that matters to the community up to the rest of us. And so just speaking out is helpful. Supporting local news outlets wherever possible, whether it's with a subscription or a contribution to public media or any publication, I think is helpful. But it really requires a number of things or a variety of approaches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree completely. And yes, to Steph's point, if you have an independent source of local news in your community, subscribe if they charge for subscriptions, donate if they have voluntary memberships. But then the hard ask is, if you don't have either one of those things, get together with a group of people and start your own. Journalism is not rocket science. It is hard work, and it's hard to expect people to put in a lot of time if they're not getting paid for it. But there are some great news sites that have gotten off the ground with volunteers and then later on became paid professional projects. There's one not far from here, the Bedford Citizen, which is a great example of that. Started with 3 volunteers from the League of Women Voters.
May I ask you, before we began this program, you and I talked quickly about the promises and the pitfalls of AI's invasion into journalism. Can you talk a bit about that? And I'd be interested in your views as well on this. Go ahead.
I'm not good. I could talk about pink slime, but I'll just leave people hanging on that for the moment. There was recently a pretty significant story in the news that the editor of Cleveland.com and the Cleveland Plain Dealer is hiring young journalists who do nothing but report. He says, I want to get as much reporting out of them as I can. And then they basically turn over their notes and AI writes their stories. And he was complaining about a young recent college graduate who didn't want to work under those conditions. But unfortunately, I think this is the way it's going. We're seeing more and more, even legitimate news organizations trying to find ways of using AI to actually produce the news. And there are ethical ways of using AI. There is the, oh gosh, I don't want to get the name of the paper wrong. The Mid-Coast paper up in Maine. They use AI to track governmental meetings in about 40 communities that they can't get to. And summaries are produced, and their reporters are expected to look at those and see if there's anything to follow up on. So I think AI can be used for ethical purposes as well.
You point to a really good use case that helps accelerate and expand reporting as opposed to replicating a part of the job. And there is so much, it's not just human-centered work, or if it comes down to that, it's really context that gets lost and nuance that gets lost. I mean, for all the people who complain about news being biased or missing certain things, that will happen tenfold if you rely on AI to write a story, because someone is choosing how to introduce a story, whose voices get told, whose don't, how much of someone's point comes across, and an AI will just, and a chatbot might just go with a standard, inverted pyramid, the who, what, where, when, why, but they're deciding every one of those things. And so it can replicate easily as many of the biases that historically journalists have been accused of having. And that's really something that, especially for early career journalists, they don't want that, because they're seeking help in learning how to be good reporters, how to be accountable to their readers, just like, our other institutions must be accountable to the public. And so, it's still very early. I've found AI to be very useful in helping teach me ways to research things, but without doing that myself, or without finding a way to get the information myself and report it, it's going to be really hard to have AI replace journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just add to that I think we see both, I think some risks of more loss of trust, even in outlets that are not using AI in irresponsible ways, that there's this, you hear stories about reporting that's being replaced with AI or AI-generated stories, and I think we already have a lot of challenges with people trusting the news and believing in the information they're getting, and the more that AI rises into that information landscape, it's harder for people to tell where we both see the need for trusted sources of information even more, and also people can feel more mistrust in the information they're getting, just because there is a lot of of AI-generated stuff out there that is inaccurate. And I think for local outlets, there's also this risk of, like, in the broader landscape of AI-generated like search results and these different summaries that come up when you Google that you want to look at a story, that a lot of times people won't be clicking through to those sites. They're not actually getting the page views because there's just the AI-generated summary at the top of the search. And so I think there's also that like compounded issue of people being able to get some content from different news gathering, from different sites and local outlets without actually having to go to their pages and, and be paying for that journalism too.
I can't tell you how many times I've searched something on Google looking for, a state report or records on something, and it'll say, oh, these are the records or the stats as of 2026, and it's actually a report from 2023.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's totally inaccurate.
That's right. The Mid-Coast Villager in Camden, Maine.
There we go.
Okay.
Very
Got
good.
it.
Listen, what would a truly free and independent press look like to you? And have we ever had one? And how would a truly free and independent press impact the health of our democracy if this were a reality, if it came to fruition? Who would like to start?
I don't know that we've seen it yet. I mean, even
In 250 years, have we seen it?
I mean, even during the so-called golden age, you had clear, like, newsroom apartheid with white, mostly male, cisgender journalists doing the bulk of the work, getting the bulk of the credit, and you had great journalism being done by historically black newspapers that did not get credit, or sometimes, sparked violence against those journalists as well as the readers they served. And so, things are really hard right now, but I can't even begin to imagine what that would look like. What I think it would entail is journalists being able to, make a living wage while reporting the news and not having a story killed because, someone up the chain said, let's not go into this. And that doesn't happen a lot, but I still hear from folks that it happens even in New England. And, there being enough funding, that is the big issue, right? Where the money comes from and who controls it. I would love to see that happen. I just don't know that we have. And, if someone does have a model that has worked and could be scaled or has accomplished that somewhere, I'd love to see it.
It's interesting you said even in New England. Can you?
I can't give specifics. Just speaking with my members and journalists in other areas over the years, they've shared examples. And it's not even, as overt as a publisher saying, well, I'm friends with this lawmaker or this business leader, don't do this. Sometimes, you'll have managers that can say, oh, well, we need more. And then, time passes and they might just pass on something thinking it's not as big a deal. Or, they might have certain relationships of, but they're not going to cite that as the reason. And also, I'm sure there's some logistical things where sometimes certain stories fall through the cracks. It's not always someone's biases getting in the way, but we're not immune to it.
Let me answer it in a micro way rather than a macro way. When Ellen Clegg and I were researching our book, I was very interested in writing about a cooperatively owned news organization. And that is something where members of the public, the staff, own and govern the news site. And, ideally that would look like a truly independent news organization.
Are you suggesting, I'm sorry, a 501c3 or?
No, a co-op
profit.
is a different kind of thing. It's not really a for-profit, it's not really a non-profit. It's its own thing. It's like a credit union, farmer's market. There's been a little bit of this at the national level, but it has not worked at the local level, unfortunately. I spent years following a project in Haverhill where they were going to start a news co-op. And they spent years trying to raise money. They never got off the ground. They finally shut down. For our book, we looked at the Mendocino Voice in Northern California because they were a small for-profit technically a no-profit. And they were going to convert to a co-op. And I went out there, and they were very excited about this, and I covered an initial meeting. Well, guess what? It was the week before COVID hit. Oh. And they had a series of events planned. They had to cancel the events. Eventually, one of the co-founders left. They continued to do good work, but they just didn't have the mind space to work on the co-op. Finally, the other co-founder ended up turning over the project to a larger nonprofit. So now it's a traditional nonprofit. And nonprofit news can be great. We can think of it as being independent, but you have to answer to a board. The board has interests in the community. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I don't think it's independent the way that Steph is talking about.
And yeah, I would just add that I think having a society where you could gauge the ability for every person to be well informed, and for that level of information to be both, covering all of the local issues that affect their lives, what's happening where they live, how they can do something about it in a language that they understand, in a format that they can access. So that to me is the ultimate goal. And when we're talking about policy solutions or interventions to try to support local news and information, a lot of times we're starting with the question of what do communities need, what information do they need, how do they need that information, because that's different from place to place. A lot of the outlets and examples I've looked at in Massachusetts are Spanish language publications that are often run on extremely small budgets and serving communities that really need that information because they've been so historically underserved or left out completely from the existing news environment. So, but there are, I'm thinking, I just went and visited out in Pittsfield a new print magazine called Somos Berkshires. There's also a paper in Springfield called El Pueblo Latino. I was just in New Bedford this morning with the New Bedford Light, and they're doing a lot of work in English, but covering a lot of the issues faced by immigrants there. I think that, and El Planeta in Boston, of course, there's so many examples, but really looking at some of the challenges that are faced by communities that have been able to get information in other ways, but rarely served by the existing formal media system. I think that when there's funding and support and the infrastructure so that all communities can have the information in the way that they need it to be able to participate in civic life, that's really important. And so a lot of times different outlets will talk about if they're serving communities that are not speaking English, if they would be able to share information on WhatsApp, for example, in a WhatsApp chat. If that's how people are getting information, as long as it's well reported and accurate and fact checked, then if people are getting information, when I spoke to the editor of Somos Berkshires, he said, a lot of times we see in the Spanish language WhatsApp channels in Pittsfield that people are just screenshotting the stories and kind of not attributing it to us and sharing it. But he said, I personally don't even care because I just want them to get the information. I want them to know, here's how you can participate in the Easter egg hunt in the community so you can feel like you're part of this community. Or here's how you can come to this local event. They did snowshoeing and they went to the art museum together with different Spanish speakers in Pittsfield. And so to me, that's another really valuable metric or way to measure, is if people are able to get the information they need to be more fully participating in civic life, to feel like they're part of the community in the language they need and the format they need, that's another big piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add since you're, no?
I just think that it's really interesting you mentioned Somos Berkshires. They've been doing great work, but it is really hard to figure out what works best for WhatsApp versus the web versus a variety of platforms, and that's still going to continue to be a challenge, regardless of background, age, cultural background. Yeah.
So has the curriculum in schools of journalism changed in the past few years to reflect all these incredible changes in the different types of media?
Oh,
for
sure.
news
I
and
mean, they don't
opinion
let me
reporting?
teach those courses.
Rude.
I'm too old. But oh yeah, we've had a revolution in the way we teach journalism with data and video and social, and we're adding some sort of a vertical video course, and we're constantly thinking about How do we reach influencers, for instance? A lot of changes, and our students are responding very well to that.
And do you have courses devoted exclusively to, preserving free press, or to how, what kind of techniques a young reporter getting started should be mindful of as, they move forward with all these different forces? I mean, we've talked about the economic changes, the technological changes, and obviously we have polarization, political polarization that's affecting all this. Are there courses specifically devoted to this, or does this run through all the courses?
Well, I would say both. Certainly ethics. Ethics is fundamental in all of our courses. That said, I do teach our ethics course. I also teach our First Amendment course, which we are going to be merging into one course in about a year. But yes, ethics is fundamental to everything that we do.
And in your experiences, do you have, ethics committees or resources, when there are questions that come up that are really tough regarding ethics and reporting, or questions of independence, people or committees you can turn to in your work?
So I often recommend to graduating seniors or to our members, in addition to asking, other members or our peers or me, to consult the Society of Professional Journalists, to just look at that and the investigative reporters and editors websites, and a few other areas to sort of brush up on various ethics. A lot of times people do learn about this in journalism school, but those who did not start out in J school might have a harder time, especially in the future as we continue to gut editors and reporters who have decades of institutional knowledge from our newsrooms. And so that is something I'm worried about, because there are times when young journalists are really eager, but they might not realize that they might be veering close to a conflict of interest. And that's not to say that journalists have to be 100% unbiased. No person is 100% unbiased. We all have our lived experiences. We all have connections that sometimes we take for granted, or gaps in different ways. But as a professional journalist, there are certain guidelines for how to navigate that or avoid conflicts or, ethically murky waters as much as possible. But it exists. Also, I would say, while this is maybe adjacent to the First Amendment and journalism ethics, a lot of the affinity groups will also have style guides and resources for ethically and thoughtfully covering various communities. If I recall correctly, the National Association for Hispanic Journalists does have some. The American, I believe, it's the Association of Journalists with Disabilities. I'm forgetting the exact name, but they have a style guide. So does the LGBTQ+ Association when it comes to covering communities that are trans or gay. So there's, a variety of resources to learn how to thoughtfully cover various communities, as well as how to navigate some ethically difficult things, though those resources aren't as common as they used to be.
Understood. So what does the future of the free press and journalism look like to you? Sarah, why don't we start with you? After all the change, I don't know if we could have envisioned where we are today, even 10 years ago. But what do you think, looking forward?
I guess I'll just start by sharing that I think whatever that future entails, there's going to need to be a whole range of outlets, business models, reporters, work that's being done to meet all of these different information needs. So that means, rebuilding or re-envisioning what a fully funded and vibrant public media system would look like in this country, and finding new ways that online and digital outlets, nonprofit newsrooms can sustain their work over the long term. I think there are so many different innovative and community-rooted models of maintaining, keeping communities informed that we need funding and public support for a whole range of models based on, again, like the community's needs, how people receive that information, what are the best ways to keep that unique community informed. But I think making sure that that's something that we have robust public investment to support so that it's treated like the public good that it is, and so that communities can really maintain that access to information that is local and helps them participate in their everyday, democracy. But I don't know what
Steph.
to say.
I don't have a good answer, to be honest, and maybe it's, me being cynical. I hope there's more funding. I hope there's more opportunity. I just don't know what that will look like. I hope there's better laws that allow for, more records requests and better practices so journalists aren't harassed when they're covering protests or, when they're writing stories that government officials or powerful people don't like. But I'm not sure what what the future will look like with regard to that.
And Dan?
I have no idea. What I hope is that we are seeing a significant local news movement in this country, and I hope it will accelerate and continue to grow, because unfortunately over the last 20 years, we've lost 3,500 newspapers, and we've seen several hundred new projects being founded. So although I'm very optimistic about what's happening with the new projects, they're kind of a drop in the bucket compared to what we're losing. And ultimately, I don't really think that public policy and government funding is going to be a significant factor in saving local news, although it's important, and I think we should do what we can.
You've mentioned some wonderful models, though, examples of initiatives that could, revive local coverage.
I think people are going to have to take care of their own needs at the community level, but we're also seeing, affluent suburban communities doing a great job of taking care of their needs. And rural areas and urban communities of color are having a much more difficult time of it. You mentioned Newton. You've got 2 very good projects here. You go to Marblehead, you've got 3. And then you've got many other communities that have nothing. And we really need to find a way to make that more equitable.
Okay, well, thank you all so very much for being here and for sharing your thoughts. I know our viewers will be edified, as I have been, by this, and we truly appreciate the spirit. You really all embody the spirit of the League of Women Voters, working to inform and engage, the local community in and help, improve not only civic engagement but our government and the lives, after all, just, of all of us. So thank you very much for your thoughtfulness. So you've been watching today's program, Freedom of the Press, a cornerstone of democracy. Today's conversation is a co-production of NewTV and the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts. The opinions and statements of our panelists are their own, and they don't represent those of the League of Women Voters or of NewTV. NewTV is Newton's award-winning, state-of-the-art media center, specializing in television production training and building community partnerships. Any use or reuse of this program requires the approval of NewTV and the League. The program must be shown in its entirety, without any editing, and only after the program initially airs on NewTV. Well, thank you again for joining us, and remember, democracy is not a spectator sport.